In the beginning of the book, the two main characters, Lily and Connie, are still living with their mother in an old, large, really grand house in their small town. Their mother makes a living by selling antiques and junk on the first floor of the house, so the girls have grown up with strangers coming in and milling around and looking at the things in their house, and they've always worked in the shop too. So at the beginning of the book, it takes place in this house, and Lily is having a piano lesson. On Thursday afternoons, my sister Connie worked the cash register and waited on customers in the next room while I had my piano lesson. The lessons took place in the West Parlor, where we sold second-hand musical instruments, dishes, kitchen gadgets, and colored bottles. A small white tag hung from the hinge that propped open the old Steinway. "Not for sale, we'll consider trade." It wasn't unusual for prospective traders to examine the piano's trusses and the action of the hammers while I plodded through Hong Kong Holiday or Sheep May Safely Graze. All the Thursday lessons have melded in my memory, an indistinguishable blur except the last one, in August 1975. It was hot and humid that day, the final free week of summer before Connie and I both went back to high school. "Let's try it again, Lily," my teacher, Mrs. Turner, said. "Pay attention to the rhythm." I slid over to the middle of the bench and looked down at the keyboard, imitating an expression of concentration. I was drowsy. The tip of my right ring finger throbbed. Connie and I had stayed up most of the night playing gin rummy, and I had been careless when she handed me a cigarette. "Quarter, quarter, 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 half, no," Mrs. Turner chanted in her quavering voice. She was a thin, mournful woman who got emotional about scales and proper hand position. When she asked about the blister, I told her I had burned myself baking cookies. Mrs. Turner was a widow of little means, or she probably wouldn't have put up with lessons to an indifferent student in a room open to shoppers. Over time, she stopped complaining about fumes from old perfume bottles, but she never got used to the interruptions as browsing customers moved in and out, occasionally trying out a battered violin or rattling saucepans and rotary beaters. It was like having a piano lesson in Woolworth's, except our merchandise was old and randomly displayed. I had been taking lessons for over 3 years, since I was 12. All the hours spent on finger positioning, laborious scales, and halting songs never made a musician out of me. Connie played much better than I did, though I was the only one who knew it. She worked out tunes by ear, but only when our mother was out. Lorraine said Connie would need to improve her behavior if she wanted lessons. She had no idea that Connie could play the theme song for MASH and anything from The Wizard of Oz. I, on the other hand, read music note by note and tried to play whatever Mrs. Turner put in front of me. I was slogging through "Let a Smile Be Your Umbrella" when Lorraine came to the doorway. "Excuse me, Mrs. Turner," she said. "I want Lily to know I'll be leaving shortly for a meeting." I knew she and her boyfriend were going out for drinks and dinner. She was wearing her frosty lipstick, her hair was teased, and she would probably change out of the beige pants she was wearing and put on her black miniskirt. She stood very straight and looked at me. "Lily, you and Connie will need to tidy up the shop after your lesson. Don't close until 6, and you two are not to go anywhere." She glanced sideways at Mrs. Turner. "Connie is grounded. Indefinitely." Connie had been caught with a joint in the parking lot at school, and I could see Lorraine was worried that the news had spread. If everyone knew, she would make sure they also knew she was addressing the problem. She flashed her teeth at Mrs. Turner and gave a little way before closing the door. "Quarter, quarter, quarter," Mrs. Turner began again, sounding like a woman throwing herself against a wall. She stamped the time with her narrow black pumps while I went on butchering umbrella. I heard my mother's boyfriend, Dennis, clatter into the house, shouting for Lorraine. Mrs. Turner paused for a second and winced before going on. Dennis's car had just roared out of the driveway when the telephone rang out in the hallway. I didn't pay any attention. Connie would have to get it, or more likely she would let it ring. But then the door opened and she was standing there. "Excuse me," she said, pushing her glasses higher on her nose. Mrs. Turner looked at her with a twitchy squint. During the years of my lessons, Lorraine always banished Connie from the parlor, commanding her not to distract your sister. I wondered if Mrs. Turner even recognized the 17-year-old standing there. Connie was wearing what she called her summer uniform: cut-off jeans, strings hanging down from the hem, and a green baseball cap. Her eyes were hidden in the glare behind her big black glasses. "Yes, what is it?" Mrs. Turner asked. "Lily's doctor's on the phone. He needs to talk to Lily right away." "Oh," said Mrs. Turner, giving me a quizzical look. "I hope everything is all right." She looked at her watch and reached under the piano for her battered satchel. "We might as well adjourn early. You are excused, Lily." I couldn't imagine why Dr. Ellington was calling and why he would ask for me instead of Lorraine. I tried to catch Connie's eye, but she was holding the door open for Mrs. Turner and didn't look at me. "Lily, I want to hear some improvement next week," Mrs. Turner said on her way out. "You want to be ready for the competition, don't you?" "Indeed she does," Connie called after her. I picked up the receiver, but there was only a dial tone. "Who was it?" "It wasn't anyone," Connie said. "But it rang." "I made it ring. There's a number you can call," she said over her shoulder, already moving to the cash register to pluck out a couple of bills. She disappeared into the kitchen and came back twirling Lorraine's car keys on her finger. "Closing time," she shouted, loud enough for any straggling customer to hear. 10 minutes later, we were cruising down the highway in Lorraine's Thunderbird, the Who blaring from the 8-track player, a pack of Lucky Strikes on the seat between us.